All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Maryland State Commission on Criminal Sentencing Policies, which we commonly refer to as the MSC CSPs, Sentencing Guidelines and MAGS 101 Orientation for Law Clerks and Court Staff. My name's Catherine Pembroke. I'm the Administrative and Training Coordinator for the MSC CSP, usually the first point of contact for the Commission. So if you've called or emailed with a guidelines or MAGS related question, I'm sure we've spoken at some point. Now, the sentencing guidelines play a significant role in supporting fair and proportional sentencing practice. And accordingly, we thank you for participating in this training because court staff and judicial law clerks have an important role in helping to ensure the consistent application of the guidelines. So I do want to note that today's webinar is being recorded, and either this video or a similar webinar recording will be made available on our training website. So if you have a colleague who was maybe interested in attending, but something came up, they weren't able to, we will be uploading a recording of this orientation to our website. So let's talk a little bit about the agenda for today's training. The concept of the guidelines may be somewhat new to some of you, so I thought it would be helpful to begin the presentation by providing throughout the course of the presentation sentencing guidelines eligibility. We're going to wrap up with a demonstration in the Maryland automated guidelines system. Oh, hold on one second. I'm getting a message that I'm freezing. Give me 1 second here. Does that sound any better, Sarah?
It does.
It does. Okay. I'm sorry, all. I'm getting an alert that my Zoom's a little unstable right now, so hopefully we can get through this. Sarah, feel free to cut in and tell me if I'm breaking up, and I'm going to try to fix it. Okay, and then we're going to wrap up with a demonstration in the Maryland automated guideline system. And this demonstration is going to include a specific emphasis on recent features that were deployed in MAGS 12.1 back in April, and then some recent features deployed with MAGS 13.0 at the end of August. Now, even though I've compiled some questions for us to review, if we get to a topic that may be relevant to a question that you have, we certainly encourage any and all questions. With me today is my colleague, Sarah Bowles. She's here to answer any questions that you have through the chat box. So if you can submit your question through the chat box, that would be ideal. That's just to ensure that we get through all of this material in a timely manner because we do have a lot that we're covering today. Also encourage you to submit your question to the entire group just so everyone can benefit from seeing the question as well as the answer. And then lastly, you should be seeing a PDF of today's presentation coming through the chat box within the next few minutes here. So you can certainly reference that, print it out or download it for future reference. All right, so let's begin with a quick review here. What is the purpose of sentencing guidelines? Now, the sentencing guidelines are a mechanism to encourage proportional sentences. The primary goal of the guidelines is to promote consistent, fair, and equitable sentencing practices, whereby offenders who are adjudicated of similar offenses with similar criminal histories, they're treated and sentenced alike. Now, Maryland's sentencing guidelines were designed to systematically account for the most common variations in offenders and their offenses, and they really help to achieve proportional sentencing by identifying and assigning weights to core objective factors for consideration by judges in making sentencing decisions. Now, the guidelines account for the most common, but certainly not all, characteristics of an offender and their crime that are most relevant to the sentencing decision, and they really help to provide a framework to allow judges to consistently assign the same value or score as their colleagues around the state for each of these legitimate legal factors. Now, let's talk a little bit about the purpose of the guidelines worksheet itself. The worksheet serves two purposes. The first purpose of the worksheet is to inform the judge of the guidelines prior to sentencing. So Criminal Procedure Article 6-216, it indicates that the court shall consider the guidelines at sentencing. And in order to do so, a sentencing guidelines worksheet must be prepared. The second purpose of the worksheet is to provide data so the commission can make informed decisions about sentencing policy. So, Criminal Procedure Article 6-210 requires the Commission to collect sentencing guidelines worksheets, automate the information, and monitor sentencing practice. So, that's especially why it is important that we're getting as many guidelines worksheets submitted as possible so that the Commission can use that data to make these informed decisions about sentencing policy. Sarah, quick check in. Is my audio doing okay?
It is, yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. All right, now Maryland's guidelines are scored on two key factors, that being the prior record and the seriousness of the offense. Now, in the Maryland system, an offender score is calculated to account for an offender's prior criminal record. In the offender score, it's a summary scale ranging from 0 to 9, which measures an offender's criminal history, accounting for four factors. That being the relationship to the criminal justice system when the instant offense occurred, juvenile delinquency record, prior adult criminal record, and then finally, prior adult parole and or probation violations. Now, the second component of the sentencing guidelines is the offense seriousness, represented in Maryland by the offense score. Now, for property and drug offenses, the offense ranking is based solely on the seriousness of the offense. But for person offenses, so those typically involving victims as well as weapon related offenses, the offense score is calculated by considering three additional factors, that being victim injury, which can be physical or psychological. So 1 point is scored for a non permanent injury, 2 points for a permanent injury or death. Weapon presence, which is defined as the presence of any article or device that reasonably appears capable of causing injury. So 1 point is scored here for a weapon other than a firearm, 2 points for a firearm or an explosive. And then finally, special victim vulnerability. So this refers to cases in which the status of the victim tend to render the actions of the offender more serious. So 1 point is scored here if the victim's younger than 11 or older than 64, or if the victim has a physical or mental disability. So next, let's talk a little bit about guidelines eligibility in general. And I'm going to start with a common question that we receive regarding guidelines eligibility. Now, do Maryland sentencing guidelines apply to misdemeanors? And the answer here is yes. So the sentencing guidelines apply to guidelines eligible misdemeanors and felonies that are prosecuted in a circuit court. There's been some confusion in recent years. I've gotten more and more questions regarding this, with a lot of practitioners thinking that the sentencing guidelines solely apply to felonies, meaning that they're not required for misdemeanors, and that's not true. The sentencing guidelines apply to guidelines eligible misdemeanors and felonies that are prosecuted in a circuit court. So let's take a look at the scope of the sentencing guidelines in greater detail here. Now, when looking at this chart, if we look to the left-hand side here, these are sentencing matters that we refer to as guidelines eligible sentencings. So these include circuit court original sentencings, jury trial prayers and appeals from the district court, but only when a pre-sentence investigation is ordered, and cases adjudicated via probation before judgments. To note, this also includes the new type of PBJ pursuant to Criminal Procedure Article 6-220C. Now, in addition to original sentencings, we also collect worksheets for reconsiderations, modifications, and three-judge panel reviews, provided that the sentencing event involves a crime of violence and there was an adjustment made to the original active sentence as a result of the recent reconsideration, modification, or three-judge review. Now, on the right-hand side here, these are matters that you'll also see handled in a circuit court, but they are excluded from guidelines coverage. So that's jury trial prayers and appeals with no PSI, if the offense carries no possibility of incarceration, violations of local laws and municipal ordinances, probation violation hearings, criminal non-support and criminal contempt cases, juvenile court adjudications, and then finally, the guidelines do not apply to district court sentencings. Now, we often get guidelines eligibility questions regarding two offenses in particular, so I want to highlight them. The first being a violation of Baltimore City Code 59-2, which is the discharging of a firearm. Now, just to clarify, even though this offense does carry the possibility of incarceration, it is a violation of Baltimore City Code, and therefore it's not guidelines eligible. So if it's being sentenced along with other guidelines eligible offenses, it would not be included or reflected on the guidelines worksheet. Now, the second offense is reckless driving, which is often charged with other motor vehicle related offenses. But since it does not currently carry the possibility of incarceration, it is excluded from the guidelines worksheet as well. Now, just to note, this
They
offense
move the volume, but that thing do the volume so that
will
they
carry the
know.
possibility of
So we're
incarceration
gonna
effective October 1 of this year. So any cases being sentenced on or after October 1, 2025, if they contain a reckless driving offense, it will be reflected on the guidelines worksheet from that point on moving forward. So just something to keep in mind. Now, I also want to note that we have worked with GIS to identify guidelines eligible cases requiring a guidelines worksheet. So here's a screenshot of the criminal docket for the Circuit Court for Anne Arundel County. And you can see if I'm looking to these upcoming cases, all of the guidelines eligible cases are marked with this MAGS yes indicator. So I did want to point out that this tool is available to you all. I know just from past discussions I've had with law clerks, court staff, they find the docket extremely helpful so that they can kind of stay on top of which upcoming cases will ultimately require a guidelines worksheet to be submitted. So again, if you think this would be helpful to reference, you can certainly reference this MAGS indicator on the criminal dockets.
Hi, Catherine. This is David. I apologize. I hope it's all right for me to interrupt for a second.
Sure.
Because I had a discussion yesterday, and I think about the docket. This would be a good time to speak about it. One of the things that we wanted to really encourage, I know Catherine said you could use this as a tool. I would change it to we recommend that you use it to a tool. If you are a law clerk with a judge that's in the criminal docket, or if you're from a smaller jurisdiction, I know your judge would probably do all the dockets, but if you're a law clerk, you should use the docket to get out in advance of knowing which cases are going to require guidelines worksheets. And we really want to try and emphasize that. It seems sometimes particular courts or individual judges, staff may wait until they get the MAGS report from the Sentencing Commission. So one of the things that if you've, if you may already be familiar with this, but each month around the 20th, let's say the 20th of each month, each court will receive a report from the Sentencing Commission that identifies all the guidelines sent cases from the previous month and whether the worksheet has been initiated and or submitted. And it seems what I learned yesterday is that some individual judges or their law clerks may be waiting to get that report to then try to go back retroactively and complete the guidelines worksheets for those cases. And while that can work, it is a significantly less efficient way to do it. It now is requiring you to go back and get sentencing information from a case that may be a month plus older. So what we're encouraging is to use the docket to identify the day of each day to say, what does my judge, have any guideline sentencing today? In which cases should we expect a worksheet? In which case you might say, go in and check MAGS and make sure the state has initiated it. So it's there. And then that way you are able to complete it promptly after sentencing. So I just wanted to share that. Sorry to interrupt, Catherine,
No,
that
no problem.
just to kind of set the expectation that really it's better to get out ahead of it in terms of trying to deal with it retroactively. You may score some points with your judge, when the monthly report comes and there are none of his or her cases listed as requiring worksheets. They probably would appreciate that the worksheet was done in a timely manner as opposed to trying to retroactively go back and do it. I'll stop there.
No, it's fine. Thanks, Dave. That's our executive director, David Soule. So thanks for chiming in with that information, Dave. That was really helpful. Yes, so we recommend utilizing the MAGS indicator on this docket so you can stay on top of upcoming cases that require a guidelines worksheet as opposed to catching up after the fact. All right, so moving on to another question just regarding guidelines eligibility in general here. Now, if the Appellate Court of Maryland has remanded a criminal case back to the respective circuit court for a resentencing, is a sentencing guidelines worksheet required in that scenario? And the answer is no. A guidelines worksheet would not be required when the Appellate Court of Maryland remands a case back for a resentencing. So as a reminder, in addition to original sentencings, we also collect worksheets for reconsiderations, modifications, and 3-judge panel reviews. when it involves a crime of violence and there's an adjustment made to the original active sentence. Now, an appellate court remanding a case back to the respective circuit court for a resentencing is a different type of sentencing matter than that of a reconsideration, modification, or three-judge panel review. So that is why a guidelines worksheet would not be required in this scenario. But just to note, if the appellate court was remanding a case back for a new trial, then we would require a worksheet for the new trial. So next, we're going to talk a little bit about guidelines compliance, and this is just a common question that I receive in general. And the question is, why is MAGS flagging the overall sentence as a departure from the guidelines? So maybe when you're going into MAGS, you're entering some individual sentence information, and you're expecting there to be a departure from the guidelines, and maybe you're not sure why MAGS is saying it's compliant with the guidelines, or vice versa. So next we're going to talk about, oh, sorry, and the answer could be that the overall sentence is not a guidelines compliant sentence. So next we're going to review what constitutes a guidelines compliant sentence. Now, a sentence is deemed compliant with the guidelines if the guidelines applicable sentence, which is defined as the sum of incarceration, credited time, and home detention time, if that falls within the applicable guidelines range. So just to note, generally suspended time is not considered when determining whether a sentence is compliant. There's one exception involving corrections options, which we'll talk about in a couple of slides here. But again, generally it's the sum of incarceration, credited time, and home detention time that's determining compliance. And I also want to note that compliance is calculated by comparing the overall sentence across all adjudicated offenses in a sentencing event to the overall guidelines range for that sentencing event. So for example, it's possible that the sentence could exceed the upper guidelines limit for one offense, fall below the lower guidelines limit for a second offense, but the overall sentence when adding together the sentence for both counts, taking in consecutive and concurrent nature, it's falling within the overall guidelines range for that sentencing event. Now, there are a few qualifiers to consider regarding guidelines compliance. And the first is that sentences adjudicated pursuant to an MSCCSP binding plea agreement are automatically deemed guidelines compliant. Now, binding pleas are three-party agreements in which the state and the defense present to the court on the record an agreement that incorporates a specific sentence. And for guidelines purposes, an MSCCSP binding plea agreement means an agreement to a specific amount of active time, if any, not merely a sentence cap or range. Now, the court has the discretion to accept or reject the plea, but the agreement is binding on the court under Maryland Rule 4-243C if the court accepts the plea. So let's take all of this information. We're going to apply it to a couple of hypothetical sentencing scenarios here. So let's look at sample case number 1. Let's say the guidelines for a sentencing event are 2 years to 8 years. The state and the defense present to the court a plea agreement to a sentence range, anywhere from probation to 2 years. The court accepts this agreement and sentences the defendant to 3 years, suspend all but 1 year. Is this an MSCCSP binding plea agreement based on the criteria that we just reviewed? And the answer is no. Now, as a reminder, an MSCCSP binding plea, it must involve an agreement to a specific amount of active time, if any, and not merely a sentence range or cap. So in this scenario, the court accepted a plea agreement to a sentence range, anywhere from probation to 2 years. So this is why it would not constitute an MSCCSP binding plea. Let's look at sample case number 2. Let's say the guidelines for this sentencing event are 1 year to 6 years. The state and the defense present to the court a plea agreement to a sentence of 5 years, suspend all but 62 days with credit for 62 days. The court accepts this agreement and sentences the defendant to 5 years, all suspended with credit for 62 days. Is this an MSCCSP binding plea agreement? And the answer here is yes. So in this scenario, there was an agreement to a specific amount of active time, that being 0, or in other words, no post-sentence incarceration. Therefore, this would constitute an MSCCSP binding plea agreement for guidelines purposes. Now, an additional qualifier regarding guidelines compliance to consider is the role of corrections options. Now, sentences to corrections options programs are deemed compliant provided that the initial sentence plus any suspended sentence. So essentially, as long as the total sentence falls within or above the applicable guidelines range, and the case does not include a crime of violence, child sex abuse, or escape. So this is the exception I mentioned earlier in which suspended time is considered for determining guidelines compliance. Now, corrections options allow judges to utilize a broader range of alternatives to incarceration while still remaining compliant with the sentencing guidelines. And various corrections options include home detention, inpatient residential treatment, inpatient drug or alcohol counseling under Health General 8-505 or 8-507, drug court, participation in any problem solving court, a sentence with required substance abuse treatment for the possession of CDS, work release, or weekend or other discontinuous incarceration. Now, here's a question relating to guidelines compliance and the use of corrections options programs. Now, do I need to mark a corrections option program, for example, drug court, if the defendant successfully completed the program prior to sentencing in their respective case? And the answer here is yes. So pre-sentence participation in drug court or any other problem-solving court should be reflected in MAGS. Sometimes defendants successfully complete a corrections option program, such as drug court, and then go on to have formal sentencing. So we do still want to capture that pre-sentence participation in MAGS. So again, if you are entering information for a case that did involve pre-sentence participation in a drug court or other problem-solving court, you want to make sure that you are checking and reflecting this correction option program in MAGS, since it does factor into guidelines compliance. So let's look at one more sentencing scenario here involving corrections options. Let's say in this scenario, the overall guidelines range is 1 year to 3 years. The defendant was sentenced to a 6-year total sentence, all of which is suspended. The defendant was also sentenced to drug court, a corrections option program as defined under commission criteria. Now, which of the following best describes the sentence imposed? Is this a departure below the guidelines, a departure above the guidelines, or a guidelines compliance sentence? And the answer here is that this is a guidelines compliance sentence. So, as previously noted, sentences to corrections options programs are compliant provided that the total sentence is falling within or above the applicable guidelines range. And again, the case doesn't include a crime of violence, child sex abuse, or escape. So in this case, that 6-year total sentence is falling within or above this overall guidelines range of 1 year to 3 years. And given the use of a corrections option, that being drug court in this scenario, this is why it would constitute a guidelines compliance sentence. And then finally, wrapping up with the last rule regarding the calculation of guidelines compliance, and that is that sentences in which the offender received credit for time served with no post-sentence incarceration time, and if the amount of credited time exceeds the guidelines range, it's automatically deemed guidelines compliant. So, for example, if the guidelines range is probation to 3 months, the sentence is 6 months fully suspended with credit for 100 days. The sentence would still be guidelines compliant even though the credited time exceeds the upper guidelines limit in that scenario. Okay, so that kind of wraps up the brief overview of the guidelines, talking about guidelines compliant sentences. So next I'm going to move to the bulk of the training, which is going to be our MAGS demonstration. Before I do so, are there any outstanding questions anyone would like to ask before we move on? Okay, I'm not seeing anything at this point. Okay, let me go ahead and bring up MAGS. Just bear with me 1 second here. Okay, so you should be looking at my MAGS login screen now. So I'm going to go ahead and just quickly log into MAGS. I'm pretty sure at this point everyone's familiar with their user ID and password. Most of you would be logging in with a court's / prefix followed by your first name, period, last name, and work computer password. But if you have questions about your user credentials, if you're having issues logging in, please feel free to contact me and we will figure that out. But let me go ahead and enter my credentials here. Okay. Now, after logging in, you're brought to the MAGS home screen. It's from the MAGS home screen where users can either create a new worksheet or you can view, edit, or delete an existing one. Now, the majority of time, you all are going to be searching the system for previously initiated cases where you then go on to enter sentence information and ultimately submit the worksheet. So I do have a test case already created, but before we do that, I do want to point out one feature that's available on our home screen here. And this is our reconsideration modification or 3-judge review for COV sentences feature. Now, as I mentioned earlier, in addition to original sentencings, how we collect worksheets for those reconsiderations, modifications, and 3-judge panel reviews for crimes of violence if there was an adjustment made to the original active sentence. Now, in that case, the state's attorney ideally should be initiating the worksheet for that upcoming reconsideration, modification, or 3-judge review. The guidelines for that upcoming reconsideration, modification, or review should match how the original guidelines were calculated for the original sentencing event. And we have this feature now in MAGS that basically allows users to copy the original guidelines calculation as long as that original worksheet was submitted through MAGS. So again, ideally the state's attorney should be initiating all of this for you, but I do want to show you how this feature works. If you happen to get one of our MAGS reports one month, and maybe you see a modification for a crime of violence on that worksheet as needing a worksheet to be initiated and ultimately submitted. And maybe you've reached out to the state, you're waiting for them to initiate it, maybe they're on leave, you're having trouble getting a hold of them. I just want to quickly show you how this feature works because it's a quick and easy step that you can take just to essentially copy the original worksheet and then move on with entering the modified sentence information. So let's just say you had your judge sentenced a reconsideration modification for a crime of violence and you're not seeing it in MAGS, so you want to utilize this feature. To do that, you would simply click on this little box here. You can see once I do that, the majority of the search features become grayed out or disabled, and you're simply going to search by the case number. So I'm going to go ahead and enter my case number here. And then click search. So you can see once I do that, I can see a return for a John Smith with that same case number. I can see it was originally sentenced back in 2023. If I look to the submitted column on the right-hand side, I can see a little check mark, and that's confirming that it was submitted in MAGS. Now, looking to the left-hand side, you can see 2 icons here. This little download icon, as judges designees, you all have read-only access to submitted worksheets. So if you ever need to view a submitted worksheet, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on in the presentation, you can always utilize this download icon, which is going to give you a copy of the completed worksheet to view and print. Now, if you're utilizing this reconsideration or mod feature and you simply want to copy the original guidelines calculation for a recent reconsideration, you would simply click copy here. It's going to ask you to confirm that you want to copy the worksheet and you click OK. And once you do that, you're brought to the offender information tab. Now you can see just by me scrolling down a little bit here, the majority of the fields are going to pre-populate based on what was entered and submitted on the original worksheet. And they're also going to be grayed out or disabled. So you're not going to be able to make selections to the majority of the information. So here I can see it pre-populates with this original information, and then I could simply just enter my name as the worksheet preparer here. And title or agency, let's just go ahead and enter law clerk. Now, if there happened to be a change regarding representation, you could make that, or PSI status, you could make that selection here. And then really, you're just clicking save this page, and that's all you would have to do. If I quickly scroll through offender score, you can see, again, this pre-populates based on original information, it's grayed out, it's disabled, same as list of offenses. And then you would just simply proceed with entering victim information just as you normally do. That's relevant to this reconsideration, and then proceed with entering the modified sentence information. So we're going to go through a test case from scratch. So I'm not going to walk through all of those steps at this point in time. But again, that's how the reconsideration modification feature works if you ever need to utilize it. Okay. So we're back to the home screen here. Again, you're generally searching the system for previously initiated worksheets. So I'm going to go ahead and filter. I'm sure you all are familiar with the various ways to filter at this point, by jurisdiction, SID number, first name, last name, case number. So I'm going to go ahead and filter by Prince George's County, and I'm going to look up an Edward Smith, and then I'm clicking search. So you can see once I do that, I get a return for two case numbers, one ending in 1122, one ending in 1144. Now, let's talk a little bit about this worksheet ID field because it's going to be an important field for you all to pay attention to. When you have multiple criminal events, which often have different case numbers, they have different offense dates, if they are sentenced in front of the same judge on the same day, that means they constitute one sentencing event. And if that's the case, the state and parole and probation, they should be initiating all of those multiple criminal events or multiple case numbers under one MAGS record. So I can see here in this case that these two case numbers are linked by the same worksheet ID number, the 187949. So this indicates to me this is a multiple criminal event, single sentencing event scenario. Now, if you search the system just generally like I did, right? You're filtering by jurisdiction and just generally by defendant name. Let's say you got a return for these two case numbers, but you're looking to the worksheet ID column and you see that they have different worksheet ID numbers. There's two issues that happen when there's a multiple criminal event, single sentencing event scenario, and the worksheets are initiated separately. The first and most important issue is that if these have different worksheet ID numbers, that means the judge is not presented with a proper overall guidelines range prior to sentencing. The second issue comes into play when you all go to eventually enter sentence information and ultimately submit the worksheets. So again, if these had two different worksheet ID numbers, you would be able to enter the information for both case numbers, no problem. You'd be able to successfully submit the first worksheet, no problem. When you go to submit the second worksheet, you're going to get a duplicate error message. It's going to say there's already been a worksheet submitted that contains the same SID number, date of birth, and date of sentence. And that's MAGS's way of catching these multiple criminal event, single sentencing event scenarios. And when that happens, you have to reach out to us. We can ultimately combine them for you under one worksheet ID and send you back a revised PDF. But I mention all of this now just so you can pay attention to this worksheet ID field and kind of get ahead of the issue. So again, if you search this system here, if I know that these two case numbers are being sentenced at the same time in front of the same judge, they're part of the same sentencing event. If I notice that they had different worksheet ID numbers, before you even start entering sentence information, I would absolutely encourage you to reach out to the state's attorney or parole and probation agent and ask them to combine those cases for you under one worksheet ID. One, it's going to save you a lot of time and when it comes to submitting the worksheets. And then two, it's a good reminder for them so that they know moving forward, that's how you properly initiate a multiple criminal event, single sentencing event scenario. Now, I will note that with MAGS 12.1 back in April, we did implement a new feature that prompts states attorneys and parole and probation to correctly initiate multiple criminal events, single sentencing event scenarios. So if they initiated a worksheet, they went to initiate a second worksheet and it contains a lot of the same information as the first worksheet, it brings up an alert and says, are these two cases meant to be combined under one worksheet ID? So that was a huge feature for us. We were really excited about it. And we have seen some positive feedback in response to it and aren't getting as many inquiries about multiple criminal events, single sentencing event scenarios being initiated incorrectly. So hopefully it's not an issue you're running into as often anymore, but again, it's a good thing to keep in mind as you're going to enter sentence information. Okay, so I searched the system, I found my case. I'm going to utilize my little icons over here. Again, this little pencil icon, that's your edit icon. Download icon, that's how you can obviously view the worksheet. And then little trash can icon is your delete icon. Now, one more thing I want to note while we're on the home screen here. let's say in this 1144 case number, let's just say there was one offense in that case number that was ultimately merged or null prost at sentencing. So we're going to talk about this multiple times throughout the course of the presentation, but merged or null prost offenses should be removed from the guidelines worksheet. But just something to keep in mind, you do not want to do that from the home screen here. So for example, even if 1144 only had one offense that was merged or null prost, if you click the delete icon from the home screen here, it's going to delete the entire worksheet ID number. So every other case that's associated with that worksheet ID would be deleted as well. So just something to keep in mind. I'm going to show you how you delete merged and null prost offenses in a moment here. If you happen to delete an entire worksheet ID, don't panic. We do have the ability to restore the worksheets. So please just feel free to reach out to us if you accidentally delete a worksheet from the home screen. All right, so normally you would just be clicking the edit icon here where again, you're brought to the offender information tab. So just looking to the various headers at the top here, you can see MAGS is divided into 7 tabs, each of which represents a different section of the guidelines worksheet, 8 tabs, sorry, each of which represent a different section of the guidelines worksheet. So generally, state and parole and probation should be completing offender information, offender score, list of offenses, and the majority of victim information for you. And then you take over and enter the remaining victim information. You complete the sentence, GLS overall sentence, alternatives to incarceration, and departure and submit tab here. So before we go to victim information, I'm going to jump on the list of offenses tab. So merged and null prost offenses, again, these should be removed from the guidelines worksheet prior to submission. Now, ideally, the state should be deleting any merged null prost offenses before you even get into MAGS and start entering sentence information. But that doesn't always happen in a timely manner, so I do want to show you how you can go ahead and delete merged null prost offenses on your own. It's a quick, easy step, and then you can just move on with entering sentence information. So one thing that I want to note here, I've gotten more and more questions about this, is that the list of offenses tab and sentence tab look identical. So a lot of you are trying to delete merge and null prost offenses from the sentence tab, and you don't know why they're not disappearing. It's because you're on the sentence tab and you want to click on the list of offenses tab to delete any merged or null prost offenses. So let's say in this case here, you can see I have a murder first degree, a burglary first degree, distribution of heroin, a felony theft of $1,500 but less than $25,000, and then a misdemeanor theft of less than $100. Let's just say this misdemeanor theft ended up being merged with the other offenses here. So I want to go ahead and delete that offense from the list of offenses tab. To do that, I simply click on the little delete offense icon and confirm that I want to delete it. And once I do that, if it happened to affect the overall guidelines calculation, MAGS would automatically update that overall guidelines calculation for you. The lesser offenses tend to be the ones that are merged or null prost, so normally it doesn't affect the overall guidelines calculation, but still just good to know that MAGS would do that for you if needed. So that's it, quick, easy, and then you would simply move on with entering victim information. Now, I just want to note that throughout MAGS, you'll see these little information icons scattered about, and then if you click on them, they give you more detailed explanations of what we're trying to capture for each field. All of the information is taken from our manual, so if you ever have a question as to what we're trying to capture, I would definitely encourage you to utilize these icons here. Now, again, regarding victim information, this is pertaining to the rights of victims at sentencing. And ideally, the state should be completing the majority of this information for you. That said, there are some fields that cannot be completed until after sentencing. For example, whether the victim was present at sentencing, if they gave a written or oral victim impact statement. So if you have that information, we ask that you go ahead and complete that on this victim information tab. And then clicking save this page. All right, so moving on to the sentence tab here. Again, it mirrors the list of offenses, so I see all of the offenses listed individually. And this is where we proceed with entering individual sentence information for each adjudicated offense. Now, I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to walk through several different sentencing scenarios here so that you have a better understanding of how you would enter the information based on the sentencing scenario. So beginning with murder first degree here. Now you can see once I click on the sentence icon rather, you can see that life is automatically selected for first-degree murder. And that is because statutorily, whenever there's a first-degree murder conviction, a life sentence must be imposed at a minimum. It can be partially suspended, but at a minimum, it must be imposed. So this is why MAGS will automatically flag life for a murder first degree. Now, jumping down here, you can see with the life box checked, I have a value of 100 years populating in the total sentence field. We had to assign some numeric value to life for guidelines and calculation purposes. So for MAGS purposes, life equals 100 years. So in this case, if you happen to have a straight life sentence imposed for first-degree murder, you would simply leave the life box checked. And then when we jump down to the suspend all but field, this includes any active jail prison, credit for time served, or home detention. So again, if it was a flat life sentence, I would simply leave it life and I would suspend all but 100 years here. And that indicates that it's a flat life sentence. Now, let's say in this case, this life sentence was partially suspended. So I want to enter a life, suspend all but 85 years with credit for 182 days. Now, I do want to note that we also have this days calculator. I'm going to click on it really quick here. So I know sometimes when you all are referring to hearing sheets, you'll see some sort of statement stating that the sentence is to commence as of, and it gives a date prior to the actual sentencing date. Now, that generally means that there was credit given from that start date to the actual sentence date. So sometimes when you're going in and entering sentence information, that credit for time served has already been calculated for you. But if you just simply have two dates, you can enter that sentence start date as well as the end date, which is generally the sentence date, and just click calculate days. And MAGS will automatically calculate the credit for you, and then you can save it to the system here. And then finally, any home detention. So I would enter 0 here. Now, also throughout MAGS, you're going to see these red asterisks. So these are mandatory fields, meaning you're going to have to enter some sort of value before moving on to the next tab here. So you can see once I enter total sentence, suspend all but credit for time served in home detention, that MAGS automatically calculates the guidelines applicable sentence for me. So again, as a reminder, guidelines applicable sentence, it's the sum of incarceration, credited time, and home detention time, generally used to determine compliance. Okay, then moving down here, we also need to indicate whether the sentence for this offense is consecutive to another count in the sentencing event. So something to keep in mind, if you do have multiple counts, maybe some of which, all of which are running consecutively to one another, you want to go ahead and mark yes. And then you're going to get this little alert saying if one count is to be served consecutively to another, that yes must be selected for both counts in order for the sentences to be summed to obtain the total sentence length in the case. So I get questions about this because sometimes if you're referring to a hearing sheet, let's say in this case, count 1, I just have a life sentence, right? And then I get to count 3 and maybe it's 20 years to run consecutive to count 1. That means when I'm entering this information into MAGS, you want to make sure you're flagging both count 1 and count 3 as consecutive. So MAGS knows to add those sentences together. Now, if you have sentences that are running concurrently or there's only one offense in the sentencing event, you can mark no in response to this question. And then one last thing I want to note while we're talking about consecutive and concurrent sentences, I want to jump back and talk about the credit for time served for a second here. Now, if you have a sentencing event that involves multiple counts, if all of those counts are running concurrently to one another, you can reflect the overall amount of credit for time served for all of those offenses. If you have a sentencing event where there's a combination of some concurrent consecutive sentences, or if they are all consecutive sentences, you only want to make sure you're reflecting credit for time served in for one of the offenses that's flagged as running consecutively. Otherwise, if you were reflecting that credit for every offense that was flagged as running consecutively, MAGS would add that credit across all of the consecutive sentences, which we don't want. It's going to give you a really high overall credit for time served amount. So something to keep in mind, if you have consecutive sentences, make sure you're only reflecting the credit for one of those offenses. All right, and then jumping down to whether a probation before judgment was granted, I'm going to go ahead and mark no in response to this. And then finally, if there was subsequent offender, let me move my little toolbar here. Give me 1 second. Subsequent offender status, if that was proven, and any restitution. So then I'm going to click Save this page and close. And you can see once I successfully save sentence information, I see a little check mark under the entered column here. All right, so moving on to the burglary first degree here. So now I want to enter a total sentence, and I'm suspending all but credit for time served. So let's just say for the burglary first degree, it was 10 years, suspend all but 182 days with credit for 182 days. So I'm going to begin by entering a total sentence of 10 years, suspend all but 182 days, right? Because this includes any active jail, prison, credit, or home detention. And then I'm also specifying that amount of credit in the credit for time served field. And then entering 0 for home detention. Now for this test case, all of these sentences are going to be running concurrently. So I'm going to go ahead and mark no in response to this question with no PBJ. And again, no subsequent offender proven and no restitution for this. And I'm clicking Save this page and close. All right, so moving on to the distribution of heroin here. Now this one's a little bit tricky. This one's going to be a 5-year fully suspended sentence. So how I would want to enter that, I'm going to begin by entering the 5 years in the total sentence field. Now, when I get to the suspend all but field, so let's just say for the sake of this sentencing, there was no credit awarded. So again, it's a 5-year fully suspended sentence. Because the suspend all but field includes any active jail, prison, credit, or home detention, I don't have any of that jail, prison, credit, or home detention if it's a fully suspended sentence. So in this case, I would be entering 0 for the suspend all but field. And I know it takes a minute to kind of wrap your head around how it's worded, because you're basically saying it's 5 years, you're suspending all but 0. But again, whenever you have a fully suspended sentence with no credit, you want to make sure you're plugging in 0 for the suspend all but field. And then one thing I do want to note as well is if you click on this little information icon next to the suspend all but field, since we're talking about some trickier hypothetical sentencing scenarios, if you click on this little link that's in the last sentence here, it's going to bring you to a document that details how to enter various sentencing scenarios. And we tried to think of literally like every scenario that you might come across. So I know a lot of law clerks and court staff have found this particularly helpful. So if you ever have a question how to enter a scenario, please refer to this document. And then you can also feel free to contact us. Okay, let me go ahead and exit out of that and bring back my sentence information. Took a little detour there. Okay, so again, 5-year fully suspended sentence. So I'm doing 5, suspend all but 0, with 0 for credit for time served and 0 for home detention. Again, these are running concurrently, so I'm marking no for sentence served, no probation before judgment. We're going to get into restitution in a moment here. So I'm going to click Save this page and close for the heroin. Okay, so that leaves us with the felony theft, 1,500 but less than 25,000. So I'm going to go ahead and bring that up here. Now we're going to walk through a couple of different scenarios here, but I'm going to start with a sentencing scenario that involves home detention. So let's just say here, this ended up being a total sentence of 1 year that is to be served on home detention. And we're also giving credit for the 182 days. So we begin by entering the total sentence of 1 year. And I'm suspending all but 1 year, because again, that's including active jail, prison, credit, and home detention. So it's still 1 year that should be populating in the suspend all but field. Then I'm specifying that there's 182 days credit. Now, when you have a sentencing that involves home detention and credit for time served, that's really the only time you're going to have to do any sort of math when it comes to entering that information in MAGS. And since we capture credit for time served in days, the easiest way to figure out the value in the home detention field would be to convert home detention into days. And then you're going to need to subtract the credit for time served from the home detention, because essentially the credit for time served plus home detention need to equal the suspend all but field. So again, I have my 182 credit for time served. I'm going to convert this 1 year into 365 days. Then I'm subtracting the 182 credit from the 365, which leaves me with 183 in home detention. So then jumping down, these are concurrent, so I'm marking no. Right now, I'm going to mark no for the PBJ. No subsequent offender, but let's say there was restitution in this theft case. So I'm going to say yes, and that it was $2,000. Now, sometimes you'll know that restitution was ordered, but a restitution hearing is going to be held at a later date. So if you know that restitution was ordered, but you don't know the amount, you could simply mark yes in response to restitution proven, and then check the box that says unknown amount here. And then you would click save this page here. So that's how you would enter a sentencing scenario involving credit for time served and home detention. Now, really quickly, before we go back and walk through another scenario, I just want to point out a new feature in MAGS. So now, if you do enter information that involves home detention, if I were to quickly jump to this Alternatives to Incarceration tab, you can see that MAGS automatically checks that there was a corrections option program utilized, that being home detention. So that's a nice nifty feature, one less thing for you to do. So I did just want to point that out if you're wondering why MAGS was automatically flagging that. It's a new feature that we deployed with 13.0. So let me jump back here. I'm actually going to clear the sentence information for the felony theft because I want to walk through 2 other scenarios here. So let's say you entered sentence information, maybe you got the counts confused, you just want to clear out the information. If you click the trash can icon on the sentence tab, it's going to delete that sentence information for you. And then bringing back up the felony theft here. Okay, so next I want to talk about this generally suspended field. So you can see if I were to check this field, MAGS would pre-populate with zeros in all of the various and required sentence fields. Now, you only want to mark this generally suspended flag if the judge is stating on the record that the sentence is to be generally suspended. Some people get that confused with PBJs, or perhaps sometimes there's no formal sentence imposed, but again, you only want to check generally suspended if the judge is stating that on the record. Now, if, let's say, I'm going to uncheck that. Let's just say in this particular case, a probation before judgment was granted with no other sentence imposed here. Now, again, because these are mandatory fields, you're going to have to enter some sort of value here. So you would simply enter zeros in all of the various sentence fields. I would be marking yes for a probation before judgment here. And then when you were to save the information and view the worksheet, you would actually see PBJ reflected in red text on the worksheet here. Now, one last thing that I want to point out, let's just say we forgot about marginal prost offenses, right? They weren't deleted from the guidelines worksheet. Maybe you don't remember that they're supposed to be deleted. So you bring up the sentence screen, and because these are required fields, you're thinking that you should enter all zeros for the marginal prost offenses. Now, let's just say you do enter all zeros and you mark that no probation before judgment was granted here. If you were to then go ahead and click save this page, whoops, I need to go ahead and enter my restitution again because it is a theft case. You're going to get this little alert. It's going to say you've entered a total sentence of 0. If the offense was marginal prost, please delete the offense from the list of offenses tab. So again, just a little reminder that marginal prost offenses should be removed from the guidelines worksheet before you ultimately submit it. So for this purpose, I'm actually just going to go ahead and mark that a PBJ was granted here. And then I'm going to go ahead and save this page and close. All right. So at this point in time, I have all of my individual sentence information entered here. And next, we're going to move on to the GLS overall sentence tab. So if I look to the left-hand side, I can see that MAGS automatically calculates the sentence across all of the adjudicated offenses for me. So here I can see that this sentencing event, the overall sentence looks to be a life, suspend all but 85-year sentence with credit for 182 days. With the guidelines applicable sentence, sum of incarceration, credited time, and home detention time. how right now, when comparing it to the overall guidelines range of life plus 0.5 years to life plus 5 years, it looks to be a below departure from the guidelines. Now, continuing with fields on the right-hand side, I would then proceed with entering the sentence date and the disposition type. So I do want to click on this information icon just to point out that we do provide definitions for all of the various disposition types. Now, if you ever have a question as to the disposition type, perhaps the terms of the plea agreement, please reach out to the state's attorney or the sentencing judge to confirm the proper disposition type before you make that selection in MAGS. Because as we talked about, MSC CSP binding plea agreements, they do factor into guidelines compliance. And we just want to make sure that the disposition types are reflected as accurately as possible. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and mark that this was an other plea agreement. Now, whenever you're entering sentence information for a case that involves a crime of violence, you're always going to be prompted to enter whether, or select rather, whether this was the original sentencing event or a modification. If this were a modification, you would then be prompted to select the type of modification. So whether this was generally pursuant to Maryland Rule 4-345, a Health General 8-507 order, or a 3-judge panel review. So in this case, I'm just going to go ahead and mark original sentencing and then proceed with entering the probation length, which is 5 years. Now, the 50% of sentence announce field, this refers to an announcement regarding the mandatory serving of 50% of a sentence for violent offenses. So statutorily, when there is a sentence, when a sentence of confinement that is to be served is imposed for a violent crime in Correctional Services 7-101. So that includes all of the crimes of violence under Criminal Law 14-101, as well as burglary first, second, and third degree. Whenever you're entering information for one of those violent crimes, you're going to be prompted to answer this question and to indicate whether there was this required announcement made in court. So let's go ahead and just mark yes in response to this question. Victim court costs. This refers to a $45 circuit court fee that should be imposed in every case and outside of any other court costs. And again, it should be imposed for all crime types. So hopefully the answer to this question is always going to be yes. And then whether a no contact with the victim was ordered, and if the judge made a written request for parole notification. And then jumping down to additional information. So this is where you can enter any additional information that the judge would like to see reflected on the worksheet. Sometimes it's just clarifying sentence information. Sometimes it's conditions of probation that the judge would like to see reflected on the worksheet. But you do have space here to do that. So then I'm going to click Save this page. All right, now I do want to quickly skip over the Alternatives to Incarceration tab, and I'll show you why in one moment here. But let's just say I did happen to enter alternatives to incarceration and I'm brought here to departure and submit. So based on all of the sentence information that you enter, MAGS is automatically going to flag whether or not there's a departure from the guidelines. So I mentioned when we were on this tab here that this 85-year guidelines applicable sentence is falling below this overall guidelines range here. So that's why MAGS is prompting you to enter, it's flagging that there is a departure and prompting you to enter departure codes. Now you'll see there's space for up to 3 departure codes. You do not have to select 3. It's really just whatever reasons for departure match the circumstances of the case. And just to note that effective July 1 of this year, this list of common departure reasons has been revised. And new departure cards were mailed out to all of the circuit court judges. So they should have all of these new reasons provided to them. Now, if I click on the drop down here, again, you can select up to 3. So I'm just going to go ahead and mark 1 for the plea agreement reached for a reduced sentence, 4 for the defender's age and health, and then 10, which is in other circumstances. So again, this list pre-populates with the most common reasons for a below departure from the guidelines, but if the circumstances for the departure do not match any of these reasons, you can certainly select other circumstances and the judge can provide whatever they would like to as the reason for the departure. So maybe we can just say defendant already serving. Oops. A lengthy sentence in another case as a potential reason. Okay, and then I would click Save this page. Now, before we go ahead and actually view the submitted worksheet, let's just say, again, I'm under the impression that I've entered and completed all of the various tabs here. So I'm simply going to click this checkbox and click submit. Now you can see once I do that, I get this alert message. It's telling me that one of the required fields is missing from the alternatives to incarceration screen. Now, just to note, this is also a relatively new feature. This alert message has always existed, but now it tells you the specific screen that is missing required information, which, based on conversations I've had with court staff and law clerks, it seems to be a well-received feature, because sometimes I know you all would be certain that everything was completed. You have no idea which screen is missing required information. So now you can just pay attention to that alert. It tells you exactly what screen is missing information here. So next I'm going to jump to alternatives to incarceration. So I'm going to go ahead and mark that yes, there was a corrections option program imposed, which was drug court, with some other alternative to incarceration. So let's also say that outpatient substance abuse treatment was entered, as well as anger management. I'm going to put as an other option here. And then, community service, let's just say 100 hours was awarded. And if there was any criminal fine imposed, you could enter that here. Okay, so now I'm clicking save this page, and you can see if I jump back to the departure and submit tab, it's still reflecting that there is a departure from the guidelines. Okay, so here is what it will look like when there is a departure for the guidelines. Now I want to switch up a couple of items, that being the disposition type, and we're going to see how compliance changes once I do that. So I'm also going to go ahead and delete the crime of violence here, that being the murder first degree, because I want to show you how corrections options factors into this as well. So next I'm going to go ahead and go to GLS overall sentence. So again, now that I've deleted the murder first degree, I can see I have a total overall sentence of 10 years, suspend all but 182 days with credit for 182 days. So that 182-day guidelines applicable sentence, it's still falling below this overall guidelines range of 1 year to 10 years. However, now I'm going to change the disposition type to an MSC-CSP binding plea agreement. And we've talked about how MSC-CSP binding plea agreements are automatically deemed guidelines compliant. So if I were to go ahead and click save this page and then jump to the departure and submit tab, you can see that now MAGS is saying that this is no longer a departure from the guidelines because it was adjudicated via an MSC-CSP binding plea agreement. It's also saying it's compliant because of the use of a corrections option program. So again, as a reminder, remember I checked drug court, which is a corrections option program. And again, this total sentence is falling within or above the overall guidelines range of 1 year to 10 years, and it doesn't involve a crime of violence any longer, which is why MAGS is saying it is compliant. So just something to keep in mind, as I mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, if you're logging into MAGS and anticipating there to be a departure from the guidelines, and maybe MAGS is saying there's no longer a departure from the guidelines, if you see MSC-CSP binding plea or corrections option populating in red and pink here, that could be why it is deeming it as compliant with the guidelines. Okay. So at this point in time, I have everything entered. I want to go ahead and submit the worksheet. Now, what I'm about to show you is a new feature that was deployed with MAGS 13.0 at the end of August here. So for those of you who have been doing MAGS for some period of time, this is a little bit different than what you're used to. So before you go ahead and click the submit button here, if you want to view a copy of the completed worksheet, print it out, get the judge's signature, you have two options to do so. And really, I always encourage everyone to click this view worksheet PDF button prior to submitting the worksheet. That way you can review it with the judge, and you can still go back and make changes before you officially submit it if necessary. So one, you can click View Worksheet PDF from that Departure and Submit tab. It brings you to the completed guidelines worksheet. Now, one other thing I want to note while we're talking about the PDF, we talked about multiple criminal events, single sentencing event scenarios. And I've been getting a lot of questions about this, so I want to highlight it today. When you have multiple criminal events in a single sentencing event scenario, by guidelines rule, each separate criminal event should correspond to its own guidelines worksheet. So in this case here, I only have one offense, that being the burglary first degree and the 1122 case. And then, whoops. If I scroll down here to the second page, this is where I have the heroin and the felony theft that correspond to the 1144 case. So again, multiple criminal events should be populating on their own guidelines worksheet. So I know sometimes when you all are viewing the worksheet, you only see one case number and you don't realize that you need to scroll, or again, that the separate criminal event should populate on its own worksheet. So that's the reason why. So just something to keep in mind with multiple criminal events, single sentencing event scenarios. So again, from here, you can print this out, review it from the judge, but let's just jump back to the departure and submit tab. Now, another little trick that I would recommend doing before you click submit, if you want to get a copy of the worksheet that has the date submission stamp, is to copy the SID number from the departure and submit tab here. And then you can go ahead and click submit. And you're always going to get an alert. It's saying that the guidelines worksheet was successfully submitted to our database, and you click OK. So you can see now MAGS is immediately redirecting me back to the home screen. And I know this has caused a little confusion because it's different and new. But the reason for MAGS redirecting you back to the home screen is just to ensure that the data that was submitted remains as is. It prevents users from being able to make edits to any of that submitted information. So that's the reason for the redirection back to the home screen. But once you're redirected back to the MAGS home screen, you can quickly search for the completed worksheet by clicking this Include Submitted Worksheets button here, and then searching for the case by any of the various ways: jurisdiction, SID number, first name, last name, or case number. So I'm just going to go ahead and do the SID number. I can quickly enter in my Edward Smith and click search here. And you can see once I do that, I confirm that it was submitted. And then if I were to click the download icon here, I have the date submission stamp in the lower right-hand corner. So that's what you would want to do. If you want a copy of the worksheet that has that date submission stamp, just make sure you're clicking Include Submitted Worksheets from the home screen and then viewing the worksheet from there. Okay, so that concludes my MAGS demonstration. Does anyone have any questions, anything they want me to show you in MAGS before I pull up our contact info and we conclude? Okay. Okay, give me 1 second. Okay, so I'm just going to quickly wrap up by sharing our contact information. I know we covered a ton of material here today, and I went pretty fast, but I was, again, trying to cover as many scenarios as you may encounter. But if you ever have questions, guidelines, or MAGS related, please always feel free to contact us. I'm always happy to help. Our main phone number is 301-403-4165. You can also email us at our general email account, msccsp@umd.edu. One last thing to mention, if you do submit a worksheet and notice that an error was made, you can contact us and we would be happy to edit that submitted worksheet and send you back a revised PDF. We just ask that you email our general email account here, reference the case number, let us know what needs to be changed, and then we can correct the worksheet for you and send you back a revised PDF. So it wouldn't be necessary to initiate and submit a worksheet from scratch. Okay, well, with that, that concludes the webinar. I'm going to check in. Sarah, David, is there anything that we want to highlight before we jump off?
No, I don't have anything. Thank you, Catherine.
Yeah, no, great job. I don't have anything either. Thank you.
Okay, great. All right, and thank you all again for attending the training. With that, have a great rest of your afternoon and a wonderful weekend. Take care, all.